Starting live video, it says. No, I should be online now. Darling, I think I'm just going to start reading. I won't. Maybe people will call me when I hang up. Let's give it a go and see. It's ridiculous. Thank you, love. I'll be in touch. Oh, here. Warren Shine. Hi, Sally. So I'm on. Yep. I'm going to just start reading, love, and I'll talk with you later. Thank you, darling. Bye now. All right. There was a question about whether I was on or not, so I was on the phone with Jason Ellis, and who is the go-to person for anything technical. He is terrific. Anyway, hello, my dears. What a start, as usual. But having gotten a message, I assume that I am definitely live and online. So we're going to just carry right on. Tonight's story is by Wolcott Gibbs, and it was written for The New Yorker in 1936. He is amazing, and it is entitled Ring Out Wild Bells. When I finally got around to seeing Max Reinhardt's cinema version of A Midsummer Night's Dream and saw a child called Mickey Rooney playing Puck, I remembered suddenly that long ago I had taken the same part. Our production was given on the open-air stage at the Riverdale Country School. The scenery was only the natural scenery of that suburban dell, and the cast was exclusively male, ranging in age from 11 to perhaps 17. While we had thus preserved the pure Elizabethan note of the original, it must be admitted that our version had its drawbacks. The costumes were probably the worst things we had to bear, and even Penrod, tragically arrayed as Lancelot in his sister's stockings and his father's drawers, might have been embarrassed for us. Like Penrod, we were costumed by our parents, and they seemed on the whole a little weak historically. Half of the ladies were inclined to favor the Elizabethan, and they had constructed rather bunchy ruffs and farthingales for their offspring. Others, who had read as far as the stage directions and learned that the action took place in an Athenian wood, had produced something vaguely Athenian, usually beginning with a sheet. Only the fairies had a certain uniformity. For some reason, their parents had all decided on cheesecloth, with here and there a little ill-advised trimming with tinsel. My own costume was mysterious but spectacular. As nearly as I have ever been able to figure things out, my mother found her inspiration for it in a Maxfield Parrish picture of a court jester. Beginning at the top, there was a cap with 3 stuffed horns. Then, for the main part, a pair of tights that covered me to my wrists and ankles, and finally slippers with stuffed toes that curled up at the ends. The whole thing was made out of silk in alternate green and red stripes. And unquestionably my poor mother's most demented stroke. It was covered from head to foot with 1,000 tiny bells. Because all our costumes were obviously perishable, we never wore them in rehearsal, and naturally nobody knew that I was invested with these peculiar sound effects until I made my entrance at the beginning of the second act. Our director was a man who had strong opinions about how Shakespeare should be played, and Puck was one of his favorite characters. It was his theory that Puck, being the incarnation of mischief, never ought to be still a minute. And so I had been coached to bound onto the stage, and once there to dance up and down, cocking my head and waving my arms. "I want you to be a little whirlwind," this man said. Even as I prepared to bound onto the stage, I had my own misgivings about these dangerously abundant gestures and their probably effects on my bells. It was too late, however, to invent another technique for playing Puck, even if there had been room for anything but horror in my mind. I bounded onto the stage. The effect in its ways must have been superb. With every leap, I rang like 1,000 children's sleighs, my melodies foretelling God knows what worlds of merriment to the enchanted spectators. It was even worse when I came to the middle of the stage and went into my gestures. The other ringing had been loud but sporadic. This was persistent, varying only slightly in volume and pitch with the vehemence of my gestures. To a blind man, it must have sounded as though I had recklessly decided to accompany myself on a xylophone. A maturer actor would probably have made up his mind that an emergency existed and abandoned his gestures as impracticable under the circumstances. I was 13 and incapable of innovations. I had been told by responsible authorities that gestures went with this part, and I continued to make them. I also continued to ring, a silvery music, festive and horrible. If the bells were hard on my nerves, they were even worse for the rest of the cast, who were totally unprepared for my new interpretation. Puck's first remark is addressed to one of the fairies, and it is mercifully brief. I said, "How now, spirit, whither wander you?" This unhappy child, already embarrassed by a public appearance in cheesecloth and tinsel, was also burdened with an opening speech of 16 lines in verse. He began bravely. "Over hill, over dale, through brush, through briar, over park, over pale, through flood, through fire." At the word fire, my instructions were to bring my hands up from the ground in a long, wavery sweep intended to represent fire. The bells pealed. To my startled ears, it sounded more as if they exploded. The fairy stopped in his lines and looked at me sharply. The jingling, however, had diminished. It was no more than as if a faint wind stirred my bells, and he went on, "I do wander everywhere, swifter than the moon's sphere." Here again I had another cue, for a sort of swoop and dip, indicating the swiftness of the moon's sphere. Again the bells rang out, and again the performance stopped in its tracks. The fairy was clearly troubled by these interruptions. He had, however, a child's strange acceptance of the inscrutable, and was even able to regard my bells as a last-minute adult addition to the program. Nerve-wracking, but not to be questioned. I'm sure it was only this that got him through that first speech. My turn, when it came, was even worse. By this time, the audience had succumbed to a helpless gaiety. Every time my bells rang, laughter swept the spectators, and this mounted and mingled with the bells until everything else was practically inaudible. I began my speech, another long one, and full of incomprehensible references to Titania's changeling. "Louder," said somebody in the wings. "You'll have to talk louder." It was the director, and he seemed to be in a dangerous state. "And for heaven's sake, stop that jingling," he said. I talked louder, and I tried to stop the jingling, but it was no use. By the time I got to the end of my speech, I was shouting, and so was the audience. It appeared that I had very little control over the bells, which continued to jingle in spite of my passionate efforts to keep them quiet. All this had a very bad effect on the fairy, who by this time had many symptoms of a complete nervous collapse. However, he began his next speech, Either I mistake your shape and making sprite, or else you are that shrewd and knavish sprite called Robin Goodfellow. Are you not he that... At this point, I forgot that the rules had been changed, and I was supposed to leave out the gestures. There was a furious jingling, and the fairy gulped. Are you not he that... He looked miserably at the wings, and the director supplied the next line, but the tumult was too much for him. The unhappy child simply shook his head. Say anything, shouted the director desperately. Anything at all. The fairy only shut his eyes and shuddered. All right, shouted the director. All right, Puck, you begin your next speech. By some miracle, I actually did remember my next lines, and had opened my mouth to begin on them when suddenly the fairy spoke. His voice was a high, thin monotone, and there seemed to be madness in it, but it was perfectly clear. 77 years ago, he began, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived... He said it right through to the end, and it was certainly the most successful speech ever made on that stage, and probably one of the most successful speeches ever made on any stage. I don't remember if I ever knew how the rest of us ever picked up the dull, normal thread of the play after that extraordinary performance. But we must have, because I know it went on. I only remember that in the next intermission, the director cut off my bells with his penknife. And after that, things quieted down and got dull. Wolcott Gibbs, for the New Yorker in 1936, Ring Out Wild Bells. I hope you've enjoyed it, my dears. Sorry about all the confusion. As I said, I needed an engineer right here, but as Jason said, I'm doing it all right. So sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes I must forget to press a specific button. So I'll try to write it down and make sure I'm online every time. I'm not one for technicalities, but thank you so much. Here we are. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's a delightful story. And I will see you again next Wednesday at 6 o'clock for Tales and Cocktails. Thank you, my dears. Good night.